Barron Trump, the towering enigma of America's most notorious lineage, was about to stumble into the wildest, most jaw-dropping showdown imaginable. A clash so explosive, so hilariously chaotic, that it's already being hailed as the greatest spectacle ever witnessed in a room full of paint and privilege. It started innocently enough, with Barron stepping into a glitzy art gallery, but what erupted next was pure insanity. An unhinged Zelensky fan, armed with rage and a grudge, hell-bent on torching everything Barron stood for. Something astonishing happened, something so mind-blowingly brilliant that it left the world gasping, but we won't spill it yet. Buckle up tight. This is the tale that'll have you on the edge of your seat, desperate to know how Barron Trump turned a night of culture into a battlefield of epic proportions. Barron Trump strode into the New York Art Gallery, his 6'7" frame slicing through the crowd like a blade through silk, his presence a magnet for every eye in the room. At just 18, he was no longer the lanky kid hiding behind his father's bombast. He was a lean, imposing figure, his sharp blue eyes glinting with a quiet intensity that hinted at depths uncharted. Tonight, he wore a tailored black suit that clung to his broad shoulders, the fabric catching the golden light of the chandeliers overhead. His hair, swept back with a casual precision, shimmered under the glow, and his every step echoed with the confidence of someone who'd learned to wield his name like a weapon. This wasn't a political stunt or a family obligation. It was personal. Barron had come to unveil a colossal artwork, a masterpiece commissioned to celebrate future leaders, with his own portrait as the centerpiece, a bold statement of his emerging legacy. The gallery itself was a cathedral of opulence, its towering walls draped with crimson velvet and adorned with canvases that screamed wealth and prestige. The air buzzed with the hum of anticipation, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged wine, and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. Crystal flutes clinked in manicured hands, their delicate chimes a counterpoint to the low murmur of voices. Art critics, socialites, and foreign dignitaries mingling in a dance of power and pretense. The floor gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting the kaleidoscope of light from a massive skylight above, where the night sky peeked through in patches of inky black. Waiters in crisp white shirts darted through the throng, trays balanced with hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most people's weekly groceries. It was a night primed for grandeur, a stage set for Barron to shine, until the Zelensky fan decided to rewrite the script. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. Lurking near the edges of the crowd, a figure stood out like a storm cloud in a clear sky. He was a wiry man in his 30s, his dark eyes burning with a zealot's fire, his frame draped in a rumpled trench coat that barely concealed the Ukrainian flag scarf coiled around his neck. Known online as Zelensky's Blade, he was a fanatic whose digital footprint was a warren of manifestos and tirades, each one a Molotov cocktail lobbed at the Trump dynasty. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers brushing against a hidden pouch where a can of red paint rested, its weight a promise of chaos. He tracked Barron's rare public moves for months, waiting for a moment ripe with symbolism, and this gilded gallery dripping with elitism, was his battleground. Tonight, he'd make Barron pay for every sin he pinned on the Trump name, real or imagined, and he'd do it in a way the world couldn't ignore. The evening unfurled with a meticulous rhythm, the gallery's curator, a pinched man with a pencil-thin mustache, ushering the crowd toward a massive draped canvas that dominated the room's center. It stood 10 feet tall, shrouded in black satin that rippled under the spotlight, its mystery a siren call to the assembled elite. Barron took his place beside it, his shadow stretching across the floor like a giant's footprint, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The crowd pressed closer, their breath a collective hum, phones already raised to capture the unveiling. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire, bathing Barron in a strobe of light that turned his pale skin almost luminous, his features sharp and regal against the dark backdrop. He moved to grasp the satin cord, his fingers curling around it with a deliberate slowness, the room's energy coiling tighter with every second. Then chaos erupted. The Zelensky fan surged forward, his trench coat flaring like wings as he shoved past a startled heiress, her champagne flute shattering on the floor in a spray of glass and foam. His scarf whipped free, the blue and yellow stripes a blur as he tore the paint can from his pouch, its lid already loose. With a feral twist of his wrist, he flung it open, and a torrent of crimson arced through the air, splattering across the satin drape in a violent slash. Gasps ripped through the crowd, a wave of shock that sent bodies stumbling back, heels skidding on the slick floor. The paint oozed downward, thick and viscous, staining the fabric in a grotesque parody of blood, its metallic stench cutting through the perfumed haze. The Zelensky fan's face twisted with triumph, his chest heaving as he thrust a finger toward Barron, his eyes wild with accusation. Though no words escaped his lips, his intent was a scream in itself, a denunciation of privilege, power, and a family he blamed for global wounds. Barron froze mid-motion, the cord still in his grip, his suit now flecked with errant droplets of red that glistened like wounds against the black fabric. His eyes locked onto the Zelensky fan, narrowing into slits of icy blue, but his body remained a statue, unyielding despite the pandemonium. Security lunged from the sidelines, their black suits a blur as they barreled toward the activist, hands outstretched to seize him. The crowd fractured, some shrieked, clutching pearls and purses, while others surged forward, drawn by the raw spectacle, their phones trembling as they filmed the madness. The curator flailed, his arms windmilling as he barked orders lost in the din, his mustache quivering with outrage. The Zelensky fan danced back, his boots slipping in the spilled paint, leaving smeared footprints like a trail of defiance. He reached into his coat again, pulling out a crumpled banner, black fabric scrawled with white letters that unfurled as he thrust it high. "Trump's lies bleed Ukraine dry." The words dangled there, ragged and bold, a guillotine over the night's elegance. Security closed in, their shadows swallowing him, but he twisted free for a fleeting moment, his banner flapping like a war flag before they tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms in a tangle of limbs and fabric. The paint can rolled away, clattering against the base of the canvas, its last drops seeping into the floor as the room spun into a vortex of noise and motion. Barron released the cord, letting it fall limp, his hands dropping to his sides as he stood amidst the wreckage. His face was a mask, cool, impenetrable, a fortress against the storm, but his eyes burned with something fierce, a spark that promised this wasn't the end. The crowd churned around him, a sea of faces torn between horror and fascination, their whispers a rising tide. Was this planned? Would he fight back? The canvas loomed behind him, its satin shroud now a dripping wound, hiding the portrait beneath. A portrait that was meant to define him, now baptized in controversy. The Zelensky fan wrestled toward the exit, cast one last glare over his shoulder, his scarf trailing like a noose, his mission half complete but far from finished. The gallery trembled on the brink, and Barron Trump, splattered and unbowed, held the key to what came next. The private corridor was a stark contrast to the gallery's gilded chaos, a narrow, dimly lit passage with bare walls and a faint hum of air conditioning. Barron Trump leaned against the cool concrete, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that stretched toward the exit like a specter of his own making. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, a swarm of notifications, texts from his mother, clipped updates from his security team, and a deluge of social media tags that painted the night in real-time strokes of outrage and awe. He silenced it with a flick of his thumb, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he processed the evening's events. The activist's howl still echoed in his mind, faint but persistent, a splinter under the skin. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and Barron knew it. He straightened, smoothing the lapels of his paint-flecked suit, and began walking toward the end of the corridor, his polished shoes clicking against the tile with a rhythm that matched his steady pulse. The door ahead led to a back exit, a discreet escape route his team had mapped out hours before the event. But escape wasn't his plan, not yet. The activist had turned the gallery into a stage, and Barron intended to keep the spotlight. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, and glanced at his reflection in a small, utilitarian mirror bolted to the wall. His face stared back calm, composed, the faint scar above his eyebrow catching the light. It was a face the world was still learning to read, and tonight he'd given them plenty to decipher. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap, crisp and electric with the buzz of the crowd that lingered beyond the gallery's perimeter. The media had spilled onto the street, their vans lining the curb, satellite dishes tilting toward the sky like eager ears. Drones whirred overhead, their red lights blinking as they tracked every movement. Barron's security team flanked him instantly, a wall of black suits and earpieces, their faces grim but alert. "Sir, the car's ready," one of them muttered, gesturing toward a sleek SUV idling nearby. Barron nodded but didn't move, his gaze shifting to the knot of reporters and onlookers 50 yards away, where the Zelensky fan still held court. The activist paced the sidewalk, his trench coat flapping in the breeze, his cracked phone raised like a torch as he streamed to his growing legion of followers. "They think they can bury this," he shouted, his voice raw but commanding, the blue and yellow scarf around his neck fluttering like a battle flag. "Barron Trump unveils some fancy painting while Ukraine burns. How's that for priorities? He's not an heir, he's a vulture circling the wreckage." The reporters ate it up, their microphones thrust forward, their cameras rolling as the activist's words ricocheted across the digital ether. His live stream's view count ticked upward. 10, 000, 20,000, 50,000, each number a spark in the powder keg of public opinion. Barron watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable. The activist was a loose cannon, unpredictable and loud, but he wasn't wrong about one thing: the world was watching, and Barron had no intention of letting someone else write the script. He turned to his security lead, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a jaw like a steel trap. "Get me a mic," Barron said, his voice low but firm. The man hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Sir, we should get you out of here." "This guy's unhinged," Barron cut him off with a raised hand. "A mic," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for debate. The guard nodded, barking an order into his earpiece, and within moments, a wireless microphone was pressed into Barron's palm. He stepped forward, out of the alley's cover and into the glow of the streetlights, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the chaos. The crowd noticed him first, a ripple of gasps and pointed fingers spreading outward until the reporters turned, their cameras swinging like turrets. The drones adjusted their angles, zooming in as Barron raised the mic to his lips. The Zelensky fan faltered mid-rant, his phone dipping slightly as he registered the figure striding toward him. For a moment, the night held its breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Barron began, his voice deep and resonant, carrying over the murmurs and the hum of machinery. The crowd stilled, phones trembling in outstretched hands, every lens trained on him. Tonight was supposed to be about art, a reflection of who we are, who we might become, but it seems some people have other ideas about what that reflection should show. He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze sweeping the sea of faces before landing on the activist. The man stiffened, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't interrupt, not yet. Barron continued, his tone steady but edged with something sharper, a blade beneath the velvet. "I don't know that man," he nodded toward the activist, "and I don't claim to understand his fight. But I do know this: chaos doesn't erase meaning, it amplifies it. That portrait in there." He gestured back toward the gallery, its golden light spilling through the windows. "It's not about me. It's about all of us, our fractures, our fire, our choices. You can throw paint, you can scream, you can tear it all down, but you can't stop the conversation. And that's what I'm here for." The crowd erupted, a mix of cheers and jeers, their voices clashing like waves against a cliff. The reporters shouted questions. "Barron, are you addressing the war? What's your next move?" But he ignored them, his focus locked on the activist. The man's face twisted, a storm of fury and disbelief, and he shoved his phone forward, his live stream still rolling. "Conversation," he spat, his voice cracking with venom. "You're a coward hiding behind pretty words. Ukraine's dying and you're playing philosopher. Barron didn't flinch. He lowered the mic, his eyes meeting the activist. Across the divide, a silent challenge passing between them. Then he turned back to the crowd, raising his voice one last time. The world's messy, always has been, but we don't fix it by breaking more things. We fix it by building something better. Good night. He handed the mic to his security lead and walked toward the SUV, his stride deliberate, his head high. The cameras followed, the drones buzzing like flies, but he didn't look back. The activist lunged forward, straining against the arms of the reporters who held him back, his scarf slipping to the ground. "This isn't the end, Trump," he roared, his voice swallowed by the roar of the crowd. "You can't outrun this." His live stream flickered as his battery died, but the damage was done. His words, Barron's words, the portrait's fractured globe, all of it was already spiraling across the internet, a wildfire no one could contain. Inside the SUV, Barron settled into the leather seat as the door slammed shut, muffling the chaos outside. His security team piled in, the engine growling to life as they pulled away from the curb. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment, the faint hum of the tires against asphalt a soothing counterpoint to the night's madness. His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it, a text from his mother. "You okay? Call me." He typed a quick reply, "Fine, we'll call soon," and pocketed the device. "Sir," the security lead said from the front seat, his voice cautious. "That was a risk out there. The guy's unstable." Barron opened his eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Risk is the point," he said simply. "He's loud, but I'm louder, and I'm not done yet." The SUV sped into the night, the gallery shrinking in the rearview mirror, its lights a fatting ember against the skyline. The activist's words hung in the air, a promise of more to come, but Barron's mind was already racing ahead. The portrait had been unveiled, the narrative seized, but the game was far from over. Whatever the Zelensky fan had planned next, Barron would be ready. The Heir of Tomorrow wasn't just a title, it was a strategy, and he intended to play it to the end. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Trump family estate, casting golden streaks across the breakfast room where Barron Trump sat, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The events of the previous night at the gallery weighed on his mind, the activist's shouts, the crowd's mixed reactions to his speech, and his own decision to walk away rather than escalate the confrontation. His mother, Melania, entered the room, her poised demeanor a quiet reassurance. "Barron, you handled yourself well last night," she said, her voice carrying a gentle strength. "But you don't have to answer every challenge. Your path is yours to choose." Barron traced the rim of his cup, his brow furrowed. "I know, Mom, but staying silent feels like hiding. People are watching, and I need to show I'm not afraid." "You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going." Melania's eyes softened with concern. "Just be careful. Not everyone wants to see you succeed." Meanwhile, across town, the Zelensky fan sat in his cramped apartment, his laptop glowing in the dim light. His latest video was uploading, a scathing rant against Barron's speech at the gallery. "He thinks he can brush me off with a few fancy words," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion and resolve. "I'll show him what real fight looks like." As the video went live, the view count surged, comments pouring in. His phone buzzed with media requests and a smirk tugged at his lips. Barron couldn't ignore him now. Back at the estate, Barron scrolled through the news on his tablet, his jaw tightening at the headlines. "Activist slams Barron Trump, symbol of indifference," in Barron's speech, bold or hollow. The activist's words stung, but they also lit a spark. He couldn't let this spiral out of control or worse, fade into irrelevance. Ignoring it wasn't an option, it would only fuel the narrative of cowardice. A direct clash, though, risked fanning the flames. Then it hit him, an op-ed. His own words, unfiltered, could cut through the noise and show who he really was. Not just a Trump, but Barron. He retreated to his study, the clack of his keyboard filling the silence as he poured his thoughts onto the page. He wrote about the portrait from the gallery, its fractured globe a mirror of a divided world, its creation a plea for meaning amid chaos. He owned his privilege, a life handed to him on a silver platter, but argued it didn't define him. "I want to build, to connect, to listen," he typed, "even to those who'd rather shout than speak." Hours later, he sent the draft to Alex, his advisor, who refined it and pitched it to a major newspaper. The op-ed hit the stands the next day and the internet exploded. Tweets ranged from "Barron's got depth, didn't see that coming" to "same old rich kid excuses." Yawn. The activist, hunched over his screen, read it with a sneer. "He's playing the sage now," he scoffed. "Words are cheap. I'll make him face the real world." He fired up his camera and announced a protest at the gallery. "We'll demand that portrait comes down or gets fixed to show the truth," he declared. "Join me. Let's make noise they can't ignore." As the protest loomed, Barron got word that the gallery might cover the portrait to dodge more trouble. Anger flared in his chest. "They're caving," he thought. "I can't let him win like that." He resolved to return to the gallery, unannounced, to stand by the art and its message. The day arrived and Barron pulled up to the gallery, his security team flanking him. Outside, a crowd pulsed with energy, protesters waving signs like "Art must speak truth" and "No privilege in paint," countered by supporters with "Let art live" and "Barron stands tall." The air crackled with chants and camera clicks as he stepped out, the noise crashing over him like a wave. He pushed forward, entering the gallery where the portrait still hung, its cracks glinting under the lights. He stood before it, lost in its layers. The globe split open, his own faint reflection woven into the chaos. Then the doors banged open and the activists stormed in, eyes blazing. "Here to guard your little shrine, Trump," he taunted. Barron turned, his voice steady. "I'm here for the right to create, to think, to rise above the shouting." The activist laughed bitterly. "Big words from a guy in a tailored suit. You don't know struggle." "You're right," Barron said, stepping closer. "I don't, but I can listen. I can learn. Let's talk, not yell. Maybe there's ground we can share." The room hushed, the activist faltering for a split second. "Talk," he echoed, almost disarmed. "Yes," Barron pressed. "Just us, no games." A protester broke the silence. "It's a trick. He's stalling you." The activist's gaze hardened again. "Nice try, Trump. I'm not here for your tea party. I want action." He spun to the crowd. "We stay until this thing's down or changed, our truth, not his." Cheers erupted, the tension snapping back into place. Barron exhaled, his gambit falling short, but he wasn't done. He signaled his security lead, who returned with an easel and paints. Barron set them up by the portrait. "What's this?" the activist snapped. "If it's truth you want, add it," Barron said. "Paint your story, make it ours." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The activist stared, then took the brush, his hand shaking. He dipped it in paint and slashed a tentative line across the canvas. Eyes widened as he added more, jagged strokes, raw and bold. But a comrade grabbed his arm. "Stop, he's hijacking us. This makes us look weak." The activist froze, doubt flickering. Barron stayed calm. "No trap, just a chance to show both sides." "Don't buy it," the comrade insisted. "He's dodging accountability." The activist wavered, then let the brush drop, clattering on the floor. "No, I won't dance for you, Trump. This is a sham and I won't touch it." He rallied the protesters. "Outside now, we'll shout where the world hears us." They marched out, voices rising. Barron watched, a pang of regret mixing with stubborn resolve. The gallery grew still, the portrait bearing the activist's brief marks, unfinished, like their clash. Alone, Barron picked up the brush, dipped it in paint, and added a small, deliberate stroke, a quiet note of hope amid the fractures. He left the gallery, the crowd's roar fatting behind him, ready for whatever came next. The gallery's grand hall simmered with an uneasy stillness, the echoes of the earlier clash reverberating off its towering walls. Barron Trump stood near the heart of the room, his 6'7" silhouette a quiet pillar amid the storm. The air hung heavy with the acrid tang of drying paint, mingling with the faint buzz of hushed voices. His sharp blue eyes lingered on the sprawling canvas before him, an abstract tapestry of global unity now scarred with jagged streaks of red, the activist's furious mark left unfinished. The polished marble floor gleamed under the spotlights, reflecting the fractured artwork like a mirror to the night's chaos. Beyond the gallery's glass doors, the protest had dissolved into the shadows, its chants fading into the hum of the city. Yet the activists' presence lingered, a specter of defiance that refused to dissipate. Barron's mind replayed the moment, the man's wild eyes, the paint can arcing through the air, the crowd's collective gasp. His swift intervention had saved the painting from ruin, but the tension it ignited still crackled, unresolved and electric. He sensed the activists' rage ran deeper than politics, a current of something raw and personal driving his actions. Barron's curiosity sharpened. He needed to know what fueled that fire. He pivoted toward his security lead, a broad-shouldered figure with a buzz cut and a jaw set like stone. With a subtle tilt of his head, Barron conveyed his intent. The guard's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening in silent protest, but Barron's unwavering gaze silenced any objection. A quick nod followed, and the guard murmured into his earpiece, dispatching orders with clipped precision. Moments later, a location surfaced, a dingy cafe a few blocks away, its obscurity a shield from the media's relentless glare. The cafe was a world apart from the gallery's elegance. Its walls peeled with faded wallpaper, the neon sign above the door flickering like a dying pulse. The scent of stale coffee and damp wood greeted Barron as he slipped through the back entrance, his frame hunching to blend into the dimness. He settled into a corner booth, its cracked vinyl creaking under his weight, and ordered a black coffee. The steam rose in thin wisps, curling upward as he silenced his buzzing phone, ignoring the flood of alerts, and fixed his attention on the entrance. The activist arrived shortly after, his trench coat glistening with rain, droplets scattering as he shook off the drizzle. His eyes, shadowed with fatigue, swept the room, landing on Barron with a jolt of recognition. He hesitated, fists clenching at his sides, the blue and yellow scarf around his neck a muted flag in the low light. Slowly, he crossed the floor, boots scuffing against the worn tiles, and slid into the booth opposite Barron. Up close, his face bore the weight of sleepless nights, dark circles carving hollows beneath his eyes, a faint tremor in his hands as he gripped the table's edge. Barron leaned forward, his coffee untouched, the steam dampening his fingers. His posture was open, unguarded, a silent invitation. The activist's gaze darted to the rain-streaked window, then back, his shoulders tensing as if bracing for a trap. For a moment, neither moved, the air between them thick with unspoken stakes. Then, with a slow exhale, the activist's defenses cracked. His fingers traced the table's scarred surface, a restless rhythm, and his story began to spill out, not in words but in the language of his body. His hands clenched, then released, mimicking the grip of a past he couldn't shake. His eyes, glistening briefly, flicked upward as if seeing a sky torn by warplanes. He tugged at the scarf, a reflexive gesture, its frayed threads a tether to a home lost to rubble. His breathing grew ragged, chest rising and falling with the weight of memories, family scattered, a brother's grave unmarked, a mother's cries echoing across continents. His fist slammed once against the table, a muted thud, the rage of survival clashing with the guilt of safety. Barron watched, his own hands tightening around his cup, the heat seeping into his skin. The activist's pain was a flood, unfiltered and visceral, each gesture a blow against the privilege Barron wore like armor. He saw his own life reflected back, the private jets, the gilded cages, the name that shaped his every step. But this was a different burden, one forged in fire and loss, and it stirred something in him, a recognition of their shared entrapment, albeit on opposite sides of the divide. The activist's movement slowed, his energy spent, his shoulders slumping into the booth. He met Barron's gaze, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the hardness. Barron exhaled, his posture easing, and extended a hand across the table, not in triumph but in acknowledgement. The activist stared at it, then, after a beat, clasped it briefly, his grip firm yet tentative. Barron rose, towering over the booth, and inclined his head toward the door. The activist nodded, understanding the unspoken end to their encounter. As Barron stepped into the rain, the cafe door creaked shut behind him, the night swallowing his silhouette. The activist remained, staring at the empty seat, his fingers tracing the table's scars once more. The rain tapped against the glass, a steady rhythm, and in that fragile stillness, a thread of possibility stretched between them, thin, untested, but unbroken. The rally's grand stage loomed over the plaza, a towering structure of steel and glass adorned with banners that whipped in the wind, each one proclaiming messages of prosperity and strength. The crowd swelled below, a restless sea of faces, some hopeful, others skeptical, their collective murmur rising like a tide against the concrete. Barron Trump stood at the platform's edge, his towering 6'7" silhouette a steady presence amid the chaos, his piercing blue eyes sweeping across the masses. Somewhere within that throng lurked the activist, a persistent shadow in Barron's mind, his intent as palpable as the electric hum in the air. Security flanked the stage in doubled numbers, their dark suits forming a formidable barrier, yet Barron knew they couldn't contain what was coming. The activist wasn't a man to be deterred by force. He was a wildfire, fueled by conviction and unshakable resolve. Barron's speech loomed mere moments away, his notes gripped tightly in his hand, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the cafe's dim light, to Ivan's faltering voice, to the projector that never flickered to life. The activist had been silent since the gala, his live streams dormant, his plans veiled. Yet Barron's instincts screamed that this was it, the inevitable collision they'd been hurtling toward. A sudden ripple sliced through the crowd, a murmur escalating into shouts. The sea of bodies parted, heads swiveling as the activist emerged, his trench coat flaring like a battle standard, his gaze fixed unyieldingly on the stage. In his hands he wielded a banner, its taut fabric screaming in bold, dripping letters, "Trump's peace is Ukraine's grave." The crowd splintered, jeers clashing with cheers, phones flashing as they immortalized the moment. Security surged forward, but the activist slipped through their ranks like smoke, his scarf trailing behind him like a defiant banner. He reached the foot of the stage, his banner snapping in the gusts, his voice erupting in a primal howl that pierced the clamor. The words were sharp, accusatory, a direct assault on Barron's legacy and intentions. The crowd's roar intensified, a chaotic blend of fury and fascination, their devices trembling as they broadcast the showdown to the world. Barron stepped closer to the edge, his shadow stretching long across the platform, his expression a fortress of composure. He lifted the microphone, his voice cutting through the storm with quiet authority, acknowledging the activist's presence while redirecting the focus to the broader audience, a call for unity over division. The activist's response was a bitter, jagged laugh, his words a venomous challenge that mocked Barron's ideals and lineage. He hoisted the banner higher, its message a relentless provocation. The crowd's energy pulsed, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. Barron's jaw clenched under the weight of his name, the expectations it carried, the history it bore. He could have countered with force or rhetoric, but instead he made a choice that silenced the plaza. Dropping the microphone, he stepped off the stage, his security team parting in stunned disbelief as he descended into the fray. His strides were measured, purposeful, his height casting a shadow that enveloped the activist as he approached. Up close, the man's exhaustion was stark, dark hollows beneath his eyes, a tremor in his hands, the wear of a solitary crusade etched into his features. Barron stopped inches away, his presence overwhelming yet calm. His voice, though soft, carried an unshakable resolve as he questioned the activist's endgame, gesturing to the crowd and urging him to consider what lay beyond destruction. The activist's eyes blazed with a tempest of anger and uncertainty. His retort was fierce, rejecting any notion of alliance, his fist tightening until the banner's pole cracked under the strain. Barron remained steady, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small, folded canvas, a fragment of the gallery portrait, its broken lines mended with strokes of blue and yellow, a tentative bridge between their worlds. He extended it, the fabric quivering in the wind, offering a choice, destruction or creation. The activist stared at the canvas, his breath uneven, his mind a war zone of principles and possibilities. The crowd watched, breathless as drones hummed overhead, beaming the moment across the globe. Slowly, his grip loosened, the banner slipping to the ground, its message crumpling into the dust. He took the canvas, his hands unsteady, and for an instant the plaza hung in stillness, the storm suspended. Then with a guttural roar, he tore the canvas apart, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. His voice broke as he declared his rejection of Barron's world, turning to the crowd with a final, desperate plea to see through the illusion of peace. The plaza exploded into a cacophony of cheers and boos, the rift widening with every cry. Barron stood motionless, the shredded canvas at his feet, his expression inscrutable. The activist retreated, his scarf falling away as he melted into the masses, security closing in until Barron's raised hand halted them with a quiet command to let him go. The activist vanished, his silhouette consumed by the crowd, his fight unresolved. Barron returned to the stage, the microphone a leaden weight in his grasp, his prepared speech now irrelevant. He faced the plaza, the faces split between hope and hostility, and spoke words of measured truth, acknowledging their shared fractures and the faint chance for repair. The response was tepid, fragmented, but it sufficed. He stepped away, the stage lights dimming, the night swallowing the scene. Beyond the plaza's edge, the activist slumped against a wall, the torn canvas still clenched in his fist, its frayed edges a mirror to his resolve. He studied it, the blue and yellow seeping into the cracks, a fragile echo of connection. His breath caught, half a sob, half a laugh, uncertain of its meaning. The war raged on within him, yet a seed of doubt took root, whispering of an end he couldn't yet name. Barron, too, lingered in the aftermath, alone on the emptied stage, the activist's discarded banner haunting his thoughts. He'd extended a hand and watched it be refused, yet the gesture lingered, a door ajar. He retrieved the fallen scarf, its worn threads a quiet keepsake, and slipped it into his pocket. The path forward stretched long and uncertain, but he would tread it, step by deliberate step. And somewhere in the city's sprawl, the activist walked on, the canvas a tether to a choice suspended between them. Unmade, but not unmade forever. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.